All right, well, welcome everybody to the 36th Annual Aquinas Lecture. The Aquinas Lecture is Aquinas Institute of Theology's service to the wider Catholic community here in St. Louis, in which we bring notable thinkers to the city to address issues that we think will energize, particularly Catholics in the area. Before we begin, I'm going to ask Brother Carlos Salas to open our proceedings here with a prayer.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord Jesus Christ, we praise you and we bless you for the gift of this life you have given us, for the mission of sharing your word. As you guided your Dominican sons and daughters to bring the gospel message to our country, may we be inspired by them to preach with zeal the salvation promised by you. And we ask for the intercession of our brother Thomas Aquinas, so that we may study your word to grow closer to you. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
It's my privilege to introduce to you Father John Vidmar, who is Associate Professor of Theology at Providence College in Providence, Rhode Island. You can see the kind of outline of his qualifications with the master's degree in ecclesiastical history from the acclaimed University of Edinburgh and a doctorate from the Dominican theologate in Rome, the Angelicum. John was here about a little over a year ago, right? And I got to sit in on some of those lectures. This man knows what he's talking about, number one. Number two, I think you're going to find that he is entertaining in the way that historians always are. They get to tell really interesting stories. And I think that those of us who are interested in the study of history, and particularly the study of Dominican history, are in for a real treat today. So John, welcome to Aquinas Institute, welcome to College Church, welcome to St. Louis.
Thanks. I just want to start you off with two slides. This is real old Dominican stuff. This is Fenwick in southern France, and this is where Dominic stood, and he saw a lightning strike, and that's how he said, where I'm going to put the nuns in the distance in Pruy. And I think, nope, back one, back, nope. Forward, there you go. I think that's it there. And there's a pathway that they love taking because that's where Dominic would have walked from Fenwick down to Pruy and back again. So that's a great pilgrimage site. And then one more to show you St. Dominic's country. That's what it looked like back in 1200, and that's what it looks like today. It's just an amazing, beautiful countryside in southern France. So I want to move it up now to, this is Carcassonne. We're going to keep going. I'm not going to talk about this. This is another talk. Yep, that's Thomas Aquinas' grave in the Church of the Jacobins in Toulouse. Okay, that's good. It's nice to be here. It's nice to be back in the Midwest, and I can actually understand people. They say God. Oh, that's good. I like that. Okay, instead of good. Okay, and stuff like that. Anyway, I got to Providence College about 16 years ago, and I had a little trouble understanding people. My first story is about the confusion I had at orientation for teachers. And they said, the guy gets up and he says, 75% of the incoming freshmen are going to be underclad. And they're going to need counselists. And I said, he can't possibly be saying underclad. I mean, I knew what he was talking about. I saw them walking around. The girls had, the shirts didn't quite come down to match the shorts, and the shorts were a little too short. And it's like, I know they're underclad, but the last thing I want to be doing is counseling underclad freshmen, okay? So, and finally, after a minute, he used the word 4 times. Guess what the word was? Undeclared. As majors. They're going to be undeclared. I thought, holy smokes, I'm in trouble here. And there are still times when I get kind of caught by somebody saying something. I thought, what? What was that? Anyway, it's nice to be here. So, this is a talk about how we came to the United States, the Dominicans. And there are three things that are highly unusual about the founding of the Dominican order in the United States. And the fact, one strange thing is that it was not founded from Ireland, which is what seemed to be the normal way that it was going to happen. It didn't happen that way. The second fact is that its very beginning, according to our constitutions, was highly irregular. The people in Rome broke every rule they could possibly break to make our group a province. And the third fact is that a good number of Spanish and Italian Dominicans kept it going once it got started. It's like, where did they come from and why? It's an amazing thing. Now, for a little bit of context. In the colonial period, the only Dominicans came from Spain and Portugal, I'm sure, and were mostly restricted south of the current border of the United States, Mexico, the Baja Peninsula, etc., and of course South America. There was a short-lived attempt to convert the Indians, which ended in 1549, when Louis Cancer was murdered along with his companions in the Tampa Bay area. Florida was abandoned by the Spanish in 1769. There were no other Dominicans that I am aware of in the territory of the United States until after the Revolutionary War. You can correct me on that. I'd love to know if there was anybody around, but I haven't been able to find anybody. And especially after the Bill of Rights was passed, and with its insistence on freedom of religion. While individual states could still have an established religion, and Connecticut would still have the Congregational Church as its established religion until the 1830s, the entire country was not going to have an established religion. The Anglicans, of course, thought that the country should be officially Anglican, as in England, but awkwardly without the king as the head of the church. But the Congregationalists thought they should be, since they were the ones who seemed to fuel the revolution from Massachusetts and Connecticut. And then what to do about the Baptists in Rhode Island and the Quakers in Pennsylvania. The president of Princeton at the time said that the only thing which kept the revolution going, moving forward, was the common hatred of Catholicism. That's from the president of Princeton. But once they fought with Catholics, alongside Catholics, and were saved by the Catholic French, the prejudice was no longer tenable. When George Washington learned that New England soldiers at Valley Forge were going to celebrate Pope Day on November 5th, which was the same day as Guy Fawkes Day in Britain, where they would hang the Pope in effigy, he said, "There will be no Pope Day." And there never was a Pope Day again. George Washington was God. When everybody started to argue about where's the capital going to be, New York or Philadelphia, he said, neither. It's going to be between the South and the North, in this swamp in Washington, right outside of Georgetown, called Foggy Bottom, and that's where it is today. So now Catholics were free to worship, even in Massachusetts, where a priest a few years before would be executed if he had been caught a second time just by being in the colony. Dominicans begin trickling in, mostly from Ireland, volunteering to serve under Bishop John Carroll, the Bishop of Baltimore, and eventually Bishop Fenwick in Boston. And they would serve as missionaries apostolic, which meant kind of freelance missionaries under the direction of a bishop. I asked an Irish Dominican about this, and I said, why did they come? He said they were on the wrong side of elections. Former provincials were among them. You become provincial in Ireland, then everyone hates you, and you go to the United States. There is a provincial from England who is living right now in California, and that's the reason he's here, basically. Anyway, I want to talk about these men first. Bishop John Carroll was struggling to establish new parishes and staff them, depended heavily on the assistance of foreign-born priests. At least 9 Dominican priests from the Irish province served under John Carroll in his newly founded Diocese of Baltimore. These could be people who were important to Bishop Carroll, too. One of them, William Vincent O'Brien. I'm just going to name a few of these. He had been provincial in Ireland and was appointed to be pastor of St. Peter's Church in New York City, which is the oldest Catholic church in New York. He served through several yellow fever epidemics in the 1790s, and he died in 1816. Francis Fleming, another Irish Dominican, was assigned to St. Mary's in Philadelphia and was named by Bishop Carroll as his vicar for the diocese's northern district, which included Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, New York State, and New England. Okay? He defended Carroll when he was accused by German Catholics of favoring Jesuits. He died of yellow fever in 1793 when 5,000 Philadelphians also died. Michael Burke came to the U.S. in 1789, and he was assigned to St. Peter's in New York and died there in 1800. 2 others would arrive in Philadelphia, a guy named Dominic May and Bartholomew McMahon, in the 1790s, respectively, and they both died shortly after of yellow fever. We have a long history of yellow fever, which culminates in our parish in Memphis, St. Peter's in Memphis, Tennessee, which is another talk altogether. Anthony Caffrey. Some of these men were not exactly helpful to Bishop Carroll. A guy named Anthony Caffrey came in 1794 and established the first Catholic church in Washington, D.C., St. Patrick's. He became a thorn in Carroll's side as he insisted that all of the District of Columbia be in his one parish. After 10 years of this, Carroll sent him to New York City. 3 years later, Caffrey returned to Ireland and died there in 1811. Some Irish Dominicans came as missionaries apostolic after the province of St. Joseph was founded, and they helped to establish the first Catholic churches in Portland, Maine, Dover, New Hampshire, Exeter, New Hampshire, Haverhill, Massachusetts, and Lawrence, Massachusetts, and a couple other places, all the time serving under the Bishop of Boston, Benedict Fenwick, who was a cousin of our founder, Edward Dominic. It would seem that the Irish province, instead of allowing its brethren to travel independently to the United States, would have considered establishing the order in a more normal way and working with the bishops as a province. But this did not happen. There's one other guy I want to mention. He's a character, and he ends up in St. Louis at one point. That's why I thought I would bring him up. He's another thorn in their side. Another Frenchman was in the Mississippi Valley. He's a Dominican. He's the restless Jean Ledru, who was ordained at Saint-Jacques in Paris just before the Revolution, assigned to Martinique in 1785. He was shipwrecked the following year, but rescued and made pastor of an Acadian parish in Nova Scotia. He never stayed anywhere for very long. 2 years later, he left Canada and was assigned by Bishop Carroll to minister to the French settlements around Kaskaskia in Illinois. The next year, he left to go to St. Louis without the permission of Bishop Carroll, who called him an apostate Dominican. In 1794, he went back to Canada, apparently to clear his name with the Bishop of Quebec, and had the intention of doing the same with Bishop Carroll in Baltimore. However, unfortunately for Ledru, he was apprehended by the British at Mackinac Island, where he was also ministering, and he was arrested as being an American spy. As he was being transported to a prison, his ship sank on Lake Ontario, and he drowned. One of our interesting missionaries, apostolic. Now enter the English. There are 3 men who are instrumental in founding the first province of Dominicans in the United States. The most important of these was Edward Dominic Fenwick. He was an American himself. He came from Maryland, and the one with the vision to return to the newly independent English colonies now called the United States of America. Not as a missionary under the authority of the Bishop of the United States, but as a member of the Dominican order and an independent province. He also was the one with the money. Whenever you talk about the province of St. Joseph, you're going to talk about money right from the very beginning. And you needed money to start a new province. This was probably actually the most important piece of the puzzle, though it is little recognized by our pious historians. This allowed us to break from the English province and become an independent province. The second most, I'll get back to Fenwick, the second most important person was an Irishman named Luke Concannon. He was the socius in Rome to the master, or to the vicar general at the time, and he was the vicar for English-speaking Dominicans. It was to Concannon that Fenwick would write in 1803, expressing his desire to move quickly to establish this province, if it was going to happen. Concannon not only encouraged Fenwick in this regard, but he broke a lot of rules in allowing the province to go forward. At the time, in 1805, to have a new province, you needed to have 4 priories. And priories at that time probably had as many as 12 members in a priory. They were big, certainly later on when you get to Jandel in the mid-1800s. You're going to get this insistence on having very big priories. You also needed to have 35 men in a province in order for it to be declared an independent province. Only 2 members of this fledgling province were actually in the United States when we got permission to start our own province. And we didn't even have a building. So there were no priories, and there were certainly 33 men short of the regulation. Concannon is the one who came up with this idea, and he got the master to agree. Concannon also will give us almost his entire library, and of which we have, parts of it are in the House of Studies, parts of it are at Providence College, and parts of it are in the archives. And he also would give us $2,000 in his will when he died, so that this province, he really believed that this thing could go. The third person who would prove essential to the new endeavor was an Englishman called Father Thomas Wilson. He had been the rector of the English Dominican College in Belgium. Fenwick said that he would be indispensable to the founding of a new college in North America. Furthermore, Fenwick said, without Wilson, he would never be able to establish the order. The English Dominican College in Bornham, I think we can, this is Concannon. Let's go back. Back one. I think that's him. And so anyway, we move on to the next one. He's buried in Naples. He was made the first bishop of New York. He never got there because Napoleon had blockaded the Bay of Naples, so the ships were never able to get out, and he would die in Naples and be buried there where he is today. And there's a long thing about all his various consecrated bishop of New York, in Rome. En route, it says, and died in Naples, 1810, and he's buried there today. One more. This is our weird church in Naples. This is where St. Thomas Aquinas actually stayed when he was there. It doesn't look like much of a church, but once you get inside, there is actually a church that looks like a medieval church. Go ahead, one more. Yeah. Okay, so here we are. Notice Vermont is not a colony, and Maine is not either. So the English College in Bornham was no more. It had begun as Holy Cross College in 1661 after religious orders in England had been suppressed by 1540. So the English Catholics are beginning to move their colleges to Spain, to Rome, and Belgium. It and a small Dominican house in Louvain lasted until 1794, so the period we're talking about, and that's when Napoleon's army came and invaded Belgium. The English Dominicans fled to England, leaving Edward Dominic Fenwick behind, thinking he's an American. They will show sympathy for him because, of course, he's one with the revolution, and he will save the buildings. This was not to be. He was put in prison for a brief time. The buildings were confiscated. They're still there. And he eventually went to England, where he would spend the next, what Fergus Kerr today says was probably a very boring 10 years. In 1803, the English province was struggling to survive. It consisted of a few missionaries, no priories, no schools. In 1822, the English provincial stated that there were only 14 men in the English province. 6 of them were over 60 years old, all of whom would be dead by 1830, and that only 3 of them were under 48 years old, of whom one would leave the order and another would die in 1831. The existence of the order in England was precarious. Younger members of the province, like Fenwick and Wilson, wanted to return to the wearing of the habit and community life. Those problem young Dominicans. They're always asking to wear the habit and to live in community life. And who opposed them? The older members who were in England, who had been missionaries on their own for years and years and been living on their own and had grown accustomed to being left alone by everybody else. So now you have a little bit of a tension growing between the young and the old in England. One proposal was simply to abolish the English province, which was actually narrowly voted down at a provincial chapter. The province's numbers would continue to dwindle until 1850, when we find only 7 Dominicans left in England. In 1850 will be a very big year for the English province, the province of St. Joseph, and the California province, actually, which is going to be founded at that time. The order in general was not in good shape. Emperor Joseph in Austria had suppressed several priories in Austria-Hungary in the mid-1700s, and this spirit carried over to the French Revolution, which saw the order completely ruined and all of its buildings and land confiscated. It would not be reestablished in France until 1850 under Lacordaire. Secularization movements similarly in Spain and Portugal saw the order suppressed in both countries in 1834 and in their North American colonies as well. In Italy, the order would be suppressed in 1870, but it was also being suppressed before that in the north of Italy under Cavour. Fenwick would not know any of this, of course, except about the expulsion of the order from France and its uncertain future in England. Impatient at the impasse, he wrote to Concannon in Rome in 1803 that he was considering founding a vicariate of the order in the United States. Not a province, but a vicariate. Vicariates are dependent on a mother province for money and for manpower, with a view that this vicariate will eventually become independent on its own and become a province of its own. Okay, and the rules on this are very strict, and Concannon broke every single one of them. Initially, Concannon thought the English might be amenable to this and had Fenwick communicate with him through the older brother of the English provincial, thinking that the provincial should actually be in on the discussion and possibly be of some help in supplying men for the American province. But the provincial, Thomas Anthony Plunkett, was having none of this, and he resisted the project from the start, trying desperately to hold his province together. Father O'Daniel's account, he was the first real historian we had in our province, the first archivist. His account that Plunkett initially opposed the project, but eventually approved it, came to embrace it through the influence of the Holy Spirit, is actually pure fiction. The English provincials opposed the American project from start to finish. He did not want to lose his youngest and most promising priests. The penal laws against Catholics, though somewhat relaxed in 1803, would be in effect until 1829 and would not permit Catholics to vote or to hold office or to build a priory. Fenwick, seeing a now free United States, the penal laws against Catholics have been lifted there with independence and the Bill of Rights, saw an opportunity for the order to grow and not just survive. It is clear from his letters to Concannon that Fenwick was proposing establishing the order in the United States and not just going as a missionary. He cites the need for more priests in the U.S., this is Fenwick, and his own temporal means, his inheritance, which is about 1,000 to 1,200 acres of land, some small houses, a proportionate share of Negroes, livestock, and a certain capital in the American funds, as urgent matters in this regard. As his health was fragile, he told Concannon, the possibility of his dying soon and losing the inheritance to his brothers was very real. Instead, if the order would be established soon, he could make use of these funds for the Dominicans. Was he exaggerating his bad health? Probably. He would live for another 30 years in very primitive conditions. The Jesuits had been the only religious order in the American colonies up to the American Revolution and had most of their influence in the colony of Maryland. The Fenwicks, whose home was in Maryland, would have known them, but the Jesuits had been suppressed in 1773 due to the machinations of the kings of France and Spain and the Earl of Pombal in Portugal, who thought the Jesuits were overly powerful, both financially and in the sphere of education. And they were meddling in the work of the colonies, the Jesuit missionaries, for example, opposing the slave trading of the Portuguese in Brazil. This explains why Dominic Fenwick's uncle, in wanting to join a religious order, would have looked elsewhere than the Jesuits. So John Fenwick, John Ceslaus Fenwick, joins the English Dominican province and went to Louvain in Belgium to study, was ordained in 1785, and moved to nearby Bornum to teach at the English Dominican College. Once the American Revolutionary War was over and the seas were safe to travel, Edward, at the age of 16, entered Bornum College in Belgium in 1784. In 1790, he made solemn vows as a Dominican, and keep going now, let's see. This is what they would have come over from England in. This is a supply ship. There would have been the first ones that came in the early 1600s to St. Mary's City to form this new colony of religious toleration, came in 2 ships. That was the supply ship. The passenger ship was about 3 times larger, but you can't imagine traveling. Whenever I fly now, I used to be afraid of flying, and I just think about going across the ocean in one of these boats, and it's like, you know, flying's not so bad anymore, for me anyway. But this is a church they would have built in St. Mary's City. It's been completely rebuilt. This was nothing. This was all like, the entire city was abandoned, St. Mary's City. It had been the capital, was totally abandoned because the tobacco crop failed several years in a row, and this was nothing about 20 years ago. And they finally discovered through excavations where the church was, where the governor's house was, and they have started to rebuild it. They want to make it into another Williamsburg, but it's not going to happen, I don't think. There's just not, they have done amazing work in trying to reconstruct what the city looked like. And it's an amazing city if you've never been there, because what the Lord Baltimore wants to do is to emphasize religious freedom in Maryland and the separation of church and state. So the governor's house is going to be over here, where you would have trials, civic trials, etc. And this is about a mile on the other side of town. And in the middle is your downtown area where you have your residences and your stores. But he really wanted to emphasize the separation of church and state. And to show you what he had in mind, the difference between what Protestants had in mind is when the Puritans will take over the government in Maryland, they move the capital to Annapolis. And if you go to Annapolis today, there is one circle called the Governor's Circle, and the next circle over, next door, is the Church Circle. There is no separation of church and state in a congregational state like Massachusetts or Connecticut or what was now Maryland. Anyway, let's keep going. This is Fenwick. These are drawings of Fenwick. I always tell my classes an actual photograph of, go ahead, next. And that's Bornham. It's the best I could find. And go ahead. And this is his solemn vows. This is the first time anybody signed his solemn vows by saying American. Edward Dominic Fenwick, Americanos. Okay, and that's the first time this has ever happened. He wanted to insist on doing that when he was still in England. Go ahead. And then you get his signature here. And one more. Okay, well, there you go. Next. Okay, so now we're going to talk about where do they go once they get here. His vision, okay, is to establish the order on his land in Maryland and then begin there a college or a high school with a few of his younger relatives as students. In another important letter to Concannon, he specifies which brothers would be helpful in this endeavor. He mentions a Father Castric, a French Dominican now affiliated with the English province, Fathers Stordur and Meerts of the Flemish province, but above all, he says the most necessary man was Thomas Wilson, who is the rector of Bornham. His talents, he says, I think would ensure me success, and a word directly from the general or you would be cheerfully obeyed by him. Would you then, dear sir, signify to him directly your and the vicar general's wish that he should join me for America? It will be more decisive and satisfactory to him than to hear it only from me, though I shall now inform him how much it is my wish to have him. Fenwick also asked for some money either from the English province or from the generalate in Rome, or both, in order to pay for transporting the men to America. Passage would cost 60 pounds apiece, and Fenwick only had 100 pounds, though he was confident he could get more. In another letter to Concannon, he worries, this is in 1804, he worries that the English provincial will not approve the withdrawal of any priests from America unless he gets a direct order from the general in Rome. In the meantime, Fathers Wilson and Angers, another prof at Bornham, told Fenwick of their desire to accompany him. Bornham had been reestablished as a result of the concordat between Napoleon and the Pope in 1801, but it was on shaky ground as there were few students in Europe's kind of uncertain environment. In 1804, in fact, Napoleon will invade again and will nationalize the church property again. This is to fuel his army. He needs the sale of these properties to do that. Other than Wilson, Fenwick was really desperate for a few others to come. These first men I mentioned, Meerts and Stoder, they never came. Castric never came. It was probably a good thing. He was a spender. And he tried rebuilding this college at a time when the college was about to close and wasted a lot of money doing so. So it was probably just as good as well that he didn't come to America. Now, Angers seems to have been a problem in Bornham. Wilson did not like him. So they're both on the same faculty. Wilson is the rector. Wilson, while president, had written to the provincial in 1802 asking for a procurator, a financial manager, suggesting James Vincent Sharp or Joseph Smith, with the monitum about Smith, if ever he come over again, he may not be as intimate with Father Angers as he was before. Adding that, Father Angers would gladly be procurator, but would, then I fear, be insupportable and refuse to do what little he does. Wilson did not like Angers, and now they're going off to America together. Angers will stay in. Fenwick is desperate, though, for bodies, and Angers would accompany him to the United States, but Fenwick had the sense to keep the two antagonists apart. Angers will stay in Maryland for 2 years at the behest of the bishop and would be assigned to parishes in Kentucky in 1807, far away from Wilson and the St. Rose Priory. On May 5, 1804, Fenwick wrote to Bishop John Carroll that his expected departure for the United States had been delayed by the provincials' refusal to let anyone go unless he had a mandate from Rome. This is what Fenwick feared all along. Fenwick had been given approval for his enterprise from Rome, but nothing was official. So he pleaded with Concannon to supply that mandate. The provincial noted that the English province could ill afford the departure of its youngest members and finest minds. The very existence of the English province was in jeopardy. We do not know Concannon's reaction. His being Irish and naturally, I think, not disposed to shoring up the English dilemma, and at the same time being sympathetic to the American Fenwick. All we know is that the departure was officially approved. Fenwick and Auger finally sailed in early September of 1804. Fenwick was about to get the shock of his life. Bishop Carroll no longer wanted him to establish a school in Maryland. Its proximity there was going to be a problem because it was going to be close to another college, which would have meant unwanted and senseless competition. That other college's name was Georgetown. Instead, Carroll urged Fenwick to follow the Marylanders out west as they were leaving for the west in droves, and there was no priest. There were no priests out in Kentucky. There was one priest in Kentucky and Tennessee. The tobacco crop had failed several years in a row, and the Revolutionary War veterans were guaranteed free land out west, and the prospects for good soil were overwhelming. Between 1800 and 1810, 300,000 people walked or rode through the Cumberland Gap in search of a better life out west. In 10 years, 300,000 people. The Indians didn't have a chance when you think about it. Tribes out there, the Choctaw and the Chickasaw Indians had tribes of maybe 3,000 and 5,000. And all of a sudden, 300,000 people were heading for their land. It was going to be a mess. Daniel Boone, so they would come from the eastern shore, they would go out to the Shenandoah Mountains, they would come down the Shenandoah Valley, would cross over the Appalachian Mountains, and then they would have to cross the Cumberland Gap on the Wilderness Road, which Daniel Boone had blazed himself. Give me one more here. See, this is where, now there are some forts here for protection. Then you get to the Cumberland Gap. The Cumberland Gap is a great thing to see because the road, the ranger there said, go down to the road. He said, that's the real road. It's not a recreation. It's not a replica. That's what they came over. And he said, and it was pretty rough. And I got to the saddle of the very highest point of the gap, and I looked down and I thought, that's pretty steep. I'm not sure I want to walk that on that particular day. And I just stood there and I thought, these guys were brave. I mean, that was not exactly Interstate 70. You know, this was, and in fact, our carriage crashed when Wilson and another guy were going out for the first time. Their carriage overturned, and one of them broke his arm, and another one had a gash in his head. They said you could see it until the day he died. Okay, now this is, and there's one more picture. I have an actual, there's a drawing of what it looked like. One more. Okay, that's what it looks like today. I mean, and that's pretty much, they did widen it, and then when the Civil War came, it was a little wider and a little more improved, but this is pretty much what they would have gone over. Go ahead. And there's an actual photograph of Daniel Boone, see? Leading a group through a very sterilized, nice picture. Go ahead. Okay. And they're going to end up in this part of Kentucky. Now, this is a major disappointment to Fenwick. He had his heart set on a foundation in Maryland and starting a college there. He had not been in this country since he left for Europe in 1784. That is 20 years ago. So he does not know about the change in economics or demographics, but he is obedient to the request by Carroll, and he heads west to find a suitable place to build a college in the wilderness. I am struck today by Fenwick's adaptability. Here he is, the son of a rich farmer in Maryland, in a civilized and sophisticated colony, used to the civilized confines of Belgium and England, and now he is being sent literally to the wilderness. When I visited the Cumberland Gap a few years ago, I asked the ranger, what was here in 1805? And he said, nothing. No towns, no general stores, no hotels. He said there were a few farms and there were a few forts here and there that were lightly populated. He was wrong. There was a tavern. There is always a tavern. And a tavern would also be an inn. It's a place that you could stay overnight. But when you came here in 1805, you brought everything with you. Your animals, your building materials, your seeds for planting, your guns for protection and hunting, but there was really very little there waiting for them. Fenwick experienced going from the King of England to Daniel Boone. It's an amazing story. Fenwick must have been buoyed by the arrival of Wilson and Tuite, T-U-I-T-E, William Tuite, who appears seemingly out of nowhere. We haven't seen his name mentioned anywhere, but obviously he was a friend of Wilson's, and Tuite would produce trouble of his own, as we'll see. The college began, vocations were made, both male and female, as Wilson called for young women to commit to teaching. St. Catherine's Convent was begun and immediately fostered vocations of its own. Now you can see how close, this is all on creeks. This is Cartwright Creek. It's going to supply you with fresh water. It's going to be a drain, but you're going to have St. Rose's here. St. Catherine's is within walking distance, and they're still there today. Actually, St. Catherine's College just closed a couple years ago due to financial problems. Whether they reopen or not is going to be a good question. But this was called Little Rome. You can see that there are going to be Holy Cross. These are towns. And if you go there today, I was there last summer and drove from one town to another. Loretto is another town. This has a community of religious women. There's St. Mary's. There's New Hope, where our hippies from California have set up a publishing or printing house. St. Thomas. The Gethsemane Trappists are here. So we, in fact, got our property from a guy who wanted to get out. He was a Protestant. He said there's too many Catholics moving into this area, and so he sold us 500 acres of land, and he got the hell out before we came. But growing pains are going to abound. The new bishop of Bardstown is a guy named Flaget. He sets up a rival college in Bardstown, St. Joseph College, and we're not sure why. And then he allows another diocesan priest to set up another college, which is only 8 miles away from St. Rose in Kentucky. It's like, why is he doing this? So attendance will fall and whether the college will survive or not is going to be one of these desperate questions we were always trying to figure out back then. Flaget always regarded the Dominicans as his kind of personal army of missionaries. So he wasn't concerned about the college and the success of the Dominicans as such. He just wanted those Dominicans to be helping at his parishes all over the place, and we did. And it's great to be able to drive those roads today, because I'm thinking these are the roads that our men actually went on carriages from church to church. Then you have the problem of Ohio. Ohioans to the north are pleading for help. So Fenwick rides north to Somerset, Ohio. Let's see if we can pull that up. Well, this would have been a normal cabin at the time. Go ahead. This is one of our houses, one of our early cabins on the property. And this is St. Rose today. It looks exactly like what it looked like probably back in 1805, not very different. And this is going to be Jefferson Davis actually attended our school in St. Rose for 1 year. He was about 10 years old, so it was like a high school. And he was caught. In his memoirs, he talks about Father Wilson and that he was caught in a food fight. And so Wilson called him in, and he said, to Father Wilson's credit, Wilson told me, I will not punish you if you tell me what you did in this food fight. And Jefferson Davis said, I turned out the lights. That must have been a hell of a food fight, you know. It's like they're bad enough if you could see what you're doing. But so anyway, he said to his credit, he did not punish me. But he said, next time, you're going to really get it, you know. And so, but that's one of our claims to fame, is that Jefferson Davis went to St. Rose. And this is the tobacco barn. This picture is probably from the early 1900s. Yeah, I don't know what's going on there. We don't want to look at that picture too closely. Go ahead, next. And this is one of our missionaries. I'm going to keep going because I want to get Ohio. He's going to be in Tennessee and Kentucky. Keep going, keep going. There we go. There's Ohio. Okay. This is Indian land in 1803. This is the first Ohio. This is the first official map of Ohio. This is where people are beginning to, white people are beginning now to inhabit. Cincinnati is down here. It's going to be the oldest big city in Ohio and will become the first diocese. So Fenwick is coming up to an area around here, is where Somerset is, in the middle of the state. Columbus is over here somewhere. Today, about 45 minutes away by car. So Somerset looks like it's going to be a big city. For some reason, we always made this mistake of thinking that really small farm towns were going to be big cities. I think Dubuque is another example of that. We thought it was going to be Chicago, you know, and we thought Somerset was going to be Columbus, and the railroads kind of changed everything. But anyway, we were there actually a little too early. But so he goes north, and he is given a gift of 300 acres of land from a farmer in Somerset, Ohio, which we still own today. And he has hopes of starting another college there. Notice it's always about starting a college. It's not about parishes, but parishes is what we are going to get. So thus the province becomes quickly split, though, between those who are serving in Kentucky, which is a slave-holding state, and Ohio, where slaves are not allowed by law. The whole enterprise would have come off the rails were it not for the diplomacy of Fenwick, who managed to hold all the pieces together. Now, I'm going to make a big mistake and ask you what time it is. So how much?
4 o'clock.
It's, okay. So how long should I go? Another 15 minutes. Okay. Well, he had gone to Europe in search of more missionaries and more money. So he's in Europe. The province went through a split, or a near split, between the Ohioans, who wanted to start their own province, and the Kentuckians. John Augustine Hill, whom Fenwick had left behind to be the vicar of Cincinnati. He has been made the bishop of Cincinnati now. This is Fenwick. He seemed to be behind the move to establish an independent province. Whether this province ever existed or not is a subject of some debate. Evidence suggests that it was attempted, but Rome, wanting to make sure it was covering its tracks, put the two provinces back together again, which leads some historians to say, well, there were two provinces because Rome was putting them back together, but Rome is actually, just in case that happened, we're going to say they're together. One question remains: having been founded by members of the English province, the province now began to attract Mediterranean Dominicans. Spain had been secularized in the 1830s, monastic property nationalized, religious orders disbanded. So the Spanish Dominicans will move mostly to the province of Viterbo in Italy. Viterbo is still in central Italy. The revolutionaries are beginning to move in from the south and the north, but Rome and Viterbo are still out of the battle zone. As they hear about the American enterprise, some of them will bite. You find names like Orengo, Cubero, Mazzucchelli, Alemanni, Villarasa, and Munoz. Now, I want to just talk about some of these guys because Fenwick's desire to bring anybody over to help supply, especially the colleges. He's looking for academics. So he finds Eugenio Pozzo and makes him the regent of studies in Somerset, Ohio. And he will try in 1845 to impose kind of rigid academic I would say, academic rigor on the studium in Somerset. And he eventually, frustrated by this attempt, there are very few teachers, and they're teaching everything. He leaves the province, and he ends up as a missionary apostolic, ironically, in a parish in New York City. Louis Orengo, in 1850, you can go back to him if you want. He is from northern Italy. No, you're going back. There we go. Louis Orengo is an Italian. He is like the missionary of Tennessee, especially. He will found 12 different parishes in Tennessee, most of which are still functioning today. He's like the Mazzucchelli of Tennessee and Kentucky. And if you drive through Tennessee, you will see historic markers in all kinds of places with Orengo's name on it, saying he founded this church, he founded that church. He was amazing. He will eventually go back to Italy and will die in Viterbo and is buried there. Francis Sadoc Villarasa is from Spain, along with Joseph Alemany, and they will both go to California to found the Dominican province in California, and Alemany will be named the Bishop of Monterey, and eventually it will be the Bishop of San Francisco in around 1848, just at the time of the gold rush. He's going to become bishop in 1850. Francis Cubero is also going to be another of these Mediterranean, I call them Mediterranean missionaries. Raphael Munoz comes over around, he had been the chaplain to the Spanish embassy in England, in London. And so he knew he actually was given a chalice, we think, by the King of Spain before he came to the United States. He will be the prior at St. Rose and is sent there by Fenwick. He's appointed by Fenwick to try to restore some kind of discipline to what had become a rather unruly house. And they say he was a little bit too strict, and even Mazzucchelli said that Father Munoz was un poco fanatico. Mazzucchelli was un poco fanatico himself, but and then Mazzucchelli is the great name because he is going to be the missionary he's going to be in upstate Michigan. He's going to be translating some of the Bible into the language of Winnebago. So he's learning all these Indian languages. There are French trappers still up there. There are English settlers moving in. He's in Iowa. He's in Wisconsin. He is really kind of an amazing figure and a bit controversial because he does become so independent. He's almost running his own show. But it does seem to me that he always belonged to our province. When the provincial is hearing things about what's going on, he actually summons Mazzucchelli to come and see him in Somerset. And Mazzucchelli comes to see the provincial. Now, an independent missionary apostolic would not do that. He would go to see the bishop, but he would not come to see the provincial of the province. So I think Mazzucchelli still had a connection to the province. And you have to realize these distances were amazing, and the communication was not that great. He is going to found lots of churches in that part of the world. When Des Moines, I think, is made a diocese, there's only one priest in Iowa at the time, and it's Mazzucchelli, when the bishop goes out there to take claim to his. He wants to start a new province, and he calls it the province of Charles Borromeo. And he actually gets permission from Rome to kind of look into this and to get it going. It looks like he actually did get it started. He invited some of his cousins and nephews to come. About 3 of them came, and they left almost immediately when I think they were faced with the rigors of the wilderness. There was no Trevi fountain to sit around and sip cappuccino in Wisconsin in 1830. So back they went to Italy, and Mazzucchelli just complained about his lazy nephews. But the Irish immigrants are also being attracted to the province, and they will come in numbers in the 1840s. And the province makes a kind of a fateful decision. They see that the action is all happening on the East Coast, where thousands of Irish immigrants are pouring in and not in Appalachia. Bishops trying to establish parishes to serve the incoming masses. We'll invite religious orders to serve in parishes and establish grammar schools. One of them, the Bishop of Baltimore, will ask us to establish the Church of St. Dominic's in Washington in 1853. We are still there. We did not have the permission of the Master General, who was furious. This is the Jandel, who envisions an order that will run colleges and will have large priories like you have in France today, Toulouse and Saint-Jacques. Do they have parishes? No. We have parishes all over the place. So he didn't want us getting bogged down with parishes. But the Irish were masters at this. They would write to the master and say, "You'll be very glad to know that at the invitation of the Bishop of Baltimore, we have accepted the parish of St. Dominic's in Washington, D.C." Now, of course, they knew he was not going to be happy about this. Having been scolded by the master never to do this again, they would write to him not long afterwards in 1867 and say, "You'll be very glad to know that the Bishop of London, Ontario, has invited us to take over a new parish, his former cathedral, which is," and the provincial writes this very cleverly, "it's just as close to Somerset, Ohio, as Somerset is close to St. Rose." Of course, they're not close at all, of course, you know. And also, he fails to mention the fact that London is in another country, okay? He didn't put that in the, okay. So, Jandel's, anyway, I think I'm going to try to end there, because what happens then is the Mediterranean missionaries will now begin to follow Villarasa and Alemany out to California, and they will begin to populate the California province rather than our province, and the Irishmen will take over. So one day you had at the Priory of Louisville the names Cubero, Orengo, etc., Mazzucchelli, and in about 5 years later you have the names Kelly, O'Toole, and etc., etc. The Irish have taken over, and they took over until, I would say, the 1970s, when all of our provincials are going to be Irish, and sometimes literally from Ireland. But then all of a sudden you get names like Haddad and Izzo and things like that. And so the change, when I joined the order, Justin Hennessy told me, there are two kinds of people in our province, the Irish and the others. And I said, oh, so I guess I'm one of the others with a name like Vidmar. Okay, but anyway, I'm going to end there. And so that's the province, the turning point is going to be 1850, because that's when we move to the East Coast and begin getting parishes out there. The church in Somerset burns down, and the prior writes to the provincial and says, this is our big chance to get out of Ohio and this muddy little farm village. No, he rebuilt it, and we're still there today. So, very good. Thank you.
So I think now we can have some questions. And I'm going to take the liberty of asking the first one. You mentioned that Fenwick, there in Maryland, was talking about his property, and there was a requisite, if I'm quoting correctly, the requisite number of Negroes. Was he slave?
Yeah, well, the province owned slaves. So you might, and we think that may be a block to his becoming canonized. Because there is some talk about, should we pursue his cause? And the province, in fact, did own slaves in Kentucky. Now, the interesting thing about slavery in Kentucky is it's very different than it is in the Deep South, where you have large plantations and cotton is the primary crop. In Maryland, or in Kentucky, and also in Maryland, it's tobacco. And it's going to be tobacco in Kentucky, too. They're going to grow tobacco, but they're going to grow other kinds of crops, and there would be very few slaves. I just read an article about this, that 25% of the Catholic families in Kentucky owned slaves, and they owned between 3 and 5 slaves. That was the ones who did own slaves. And there is, in fact, a record of our giving some of our slaves to the Sisters of St. Catherine because their farm was failing, and they needed basically free help to get it going, and they actually saved the farm and saved St. Catherine's by those slaves being there. So there's an interesting difference between how some of the slaves in Maryland actually slept in the house with the masters. So there seems to have been a much more, certainly a human relationship between the slave and the owner, the master. I mean, it's a horrible institution, and the Ohioans were dead against it.
The reason I ask is because, of course, we're all aware that Georgetown has taken significant moves to, if you will, atone for the fact that the Society of Jesus at one point owned slaves.
Yeah.
There's even talk that some of those slaves came out to Missouri, were instrumental in the founding of St. Louis University, or at least in the taking over of St. Louis University once it became a Jesuit institution. Has there been a similar effort, so to speak, to at least minimally apologize, if not actually to atone for the slave owning of the Dominicans on the East Coast?
Yeah, what we're doing right now is we're looking into memorializing the slaves we had, which has been done at St. Catherine's. They have put up a monument to them. I don't hear of any attempt to compensate anyone financially from our province. So I don't see that happening anytime soon. I think they want to do something, though, to actually identify what slaves we had and the work that they did there. So it's an interesting. The one person that I think is really interesting is an ex-slave who came to our house in Memphis, Sam Henderson, and we have photographs of him. And when the Civil War was over, he was a Baptist. He started showing up at our parish, which is an Irish. It was thoroughly Irish. And he felt welcome, and he would go every Sunday to listen to the sermon, and then he would go back to his Baptist church and kind of rework the sermon into a language that his congregation could understand. And then he became our maintenance man, and he was at St. Peter's for 50 years. And he buried 8 of our Dominicans who died during yellow fever epidemics, which was considered to be extremely dangerous. I mean, nobody knew what was causing it. Nobody knew how it was being spread. So to even touch the clothing of somebody who died was looked on as suicidal almost. He cleaned all of the bodies, dressed them in their habits, and made sure they got a proper burial. He died in 1910, and when he died, he became Catholic. They had a solemn high funeral mass for him at St. Peter's, and they bought him the 8 pallbearers were all Dominican priests. And this is 1910 in Memphis, and they bought him a monument for the part in the cemetery where he's buried. And you can still see some of that monument today. Now that story I love, but the slave thing is a little earlier than that, obviously. It's before the Civil War.
Kevin.
Nothing too difficult, please.
I don't know. All right, so Fenwick went on to Bardstown, and I've always heard that about that. You mentioned Bardstown, you mentioned Dubuque.
South of Louisville.
Okay. My question is more about Bardstown. Whose idea was it that Bardstown was going to be this big center? Was it just a PR move, or land speculators, or who really pumped this up?
That's a good question. It's before railroads. So again, the road system is such that it looks like this wilderness road is the road. Like Zane's Trace going through Ohio was the only road in Ohio. So consequently, we have a house in Zanesville, which is on Zane's Trace, Route 22 today. Somerset is on that. And actually, we had a house in Cincinnati as well, where the road actually ends. So the roads were looked on as this is where the country is going to develop. Sometimes along canals as well. But when the railroad came, it changed the whole equation. And I think Louisville really hadn't developed yet. They still had the falls of the Ohio, which was a problem to overcome. And then finally, I think they figured that out, and they could navigate the whole, especially with steamboats. Once they became, you could actually go back up the river, whereas in the beginning, the flatboats would just simply come downstream, and they'd be disassembled, and you couldn't really get back up. So steamboats, I think, would change the equation as well, and that's where Louisville will really eclipse Bardstown as a major city. But the fact that a bishop was appointed to be in Bardstown, 1810, I think that happens, or 1808. You have the new dioceses are made of New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and Bardstown. It's the first city on the other side of the Appalachians. So I do think it has to do more with the roads than, yep.
Father, thank you for being here today. As you may or may not be aware, both of our provinces, and I think also the Western and Eastern province, have made a recommitment to our ministries in colleges. And having read some of the journals of our brothers, having studied this early history, what lesson from history would you think is most important for Dominicans today to remember as we continue our college ministry here in the United States?
Education it's extremely important. I think what we did was interesting in terms of Providence College, because it's the only college in the country run by Dominican men. And we decided to kind of put all of our eggs into one basket rather than what the Jesuits did, which was to have lots of colleges, lots of high schools. And now I think they're suffering a little bit from that, a kind of almost over-commitment to those places. I mean, you have a lay person who's now the president of Georgetown, and that's not exactly, I think, that's not the ideal for them. So we're still, I think, committed to those, and now we're reaching out now. St. John's University, I'm sure you are doing the same thing. You're looking at opportunities at colleges. The parishes were really important for us for a long time, and I think they still are. I mean, I wouldn't give up on parish ministry because I think that's where our preaching really kind of hits the road. You know, that's where the rubber hits the road kind of. It does in colleges too. It's two different, I've been in both, and parish ministries are fantastic in terms of the variety of ministries you get. But in the beginning, one thing that really changed our province was the parish missions, and that we would form mission bands. And I have a couple of, I'm going to move this up. Let me show you. This is, okay. They're transporting the nut. That's in Somerset. Fenwick said Mass in this place outside of Canton, Ohio. This is the studentate at Somerset. This is the provincial and the prior of Somerset going out hunting. This is our first mission band in what they called the Northwest. So it was going to be in the area of Chicago and St. Paul, Minnesota, in that area. These are going to be, it's a team of preachers. One of them would be designated as the star. You know, he was like the older, experienced preacher, and he was the big draw. And the others would assist him with communions, confessions, and they would also be apprentices to his preaching to kind of see how it was done. But this one I love. It's next one. I call this the grim bearers of the glad tidings. That's a mission band in 1865. But what these mission bands did was they made a lot of money, which enabled us to build the House of Studies in Washington in 1905, Fenwick High School, and Providence College. Because they really did, they would go for a week to 2 weeks to a parish. And they were very popular. I mean, this is before TV and radio. And so it was kind of a big show that went on. And if you were a good preacher, you could get a fairly big audience. And it helped actually build our churches in Louisville, for example, was built by a famous preacher from Ireland who came over, named, I think his name was White. I'm blanking right now. But he came over as a visitor from the master and stayed for 2 years and just preached and really helped to raise money, and it kind of put us on a secure footing that way, and then we could do other ministries. So that's kind of an important part of it. I said money is important. When we take the mission in Africa, they wanted the southern province to take it. It seemed a natural thing to do. can't quite do it. You know, it's going to take a lot of money to do that and to send men over. And it was like, let's see who else can cobble this together. So that part of it is an important part of the ministry. But certainly getting into colleges now is really, I think that's where vocations are coming from. That's where I think a new wave, a new generation is really becoming interested in the faith. I'm finding that all the time. At that age, now I got a letter from one of my students a couple years ago. I wish I had it with me, because she said, I went to a really hotsy-totsy secular high school where they just dismissed religion, really. She said they talked about religious toleration, but she said there was a real hostility that you could feel. And she said it began to affect me. And I was going through the motions. And she said all of a sudden, I come to class at PC, and there's a priest up there who's talking about Western civilization, and here's a believer and committed and wearing this habit. And she said, this changed my whole view of the thing. And she said, and I saw there's 35 of them on this campus. And some of them, they're not stupid. They're in biology, they're in physics, they're in math, you know. And she said, all of a sudden, I began to realize to take my faith a lot more seriously. So that's a very important thing for us to be doing, but I think we need to kind of do both if we can. Yes?
Kind of right. John, have you come across in your research about the Spanish friars who came from, I think, Manila to New Orleans in the 1870s?
Yes.
Can you share something about that?
Give me a little time to find this. We called that, I just saw this the other day. I have a thing on elections that'll be interesting for tomorrow for you guys. Let me just look for this a little, if I can't find it soon. We called that the Louisiana Purchase because we got so many parishes all at once. It was just amazing. Let's see, parish. Let me, tourism chaplains, home missions. I'm close. Any other questions before I keep looking for this thing?
Father Vidmar, thank you for being here. I'm interested in, so Fenwick becomes the Bishop of Cincinnati. If you could say a little about how that affects the order and their presence in that area.
Yes, it's very complicated because he becomes the Bishop of Cincinnati. The only priests in Ohio are Dominicans. Every single parish in Ohio is founded by Dominicans. So now what is he? The provincial? They make him the commissary general, which means the acting provincial, basically, of the province to solve all this problem. Tuit, when I said he was going to cause problems, Wilson and Tuit are together in St. Rose. Wilson dies, and Fenwick is in Europe. So Tuit declares himself to be the provincial because he was one of the 4 founding members. Okay? No election. And so Fenwick comes back to the United States with all of this going on. The provinces are splitting. He said, no, they're not split anymore. Tuit's claiming to be the provincial, and Fenwick says, no, I have papers. I have been named the provincial. So you're out, okay? So we can at least establish that. But there was was he recruiting priests to be in his diocese of Cincinnati, or was he recruiting them to be members of the order? He makes one very unbelievable suggestion, and that is he proposes to Rome that Ohio be in perpetuity a Dominican diocese. What was he thinking? You know, I mean, when has that ever happened in the history of the world, you know? It's like, so that, nope, there would be no other religious orders. We would have the whole state. And it was just, it's just bizarre that he proposed this, that he thought it would happen. And obviously it did not. So it is very complicated once he becomes the bishop. I have one thing on Louisiana I think I have found. Yes. In 1938 alone, 1938, now this is during the Spanish Civil War, 7 parishes were given to the province by the Bishop of New Orleans, Bishop John Francis Rummel, an acquisition that the provincial McDermott referred to as the Louisiana Purchase, since all the houses were in Louisiana. St. Anthony of Padua in New Orleans, St. Dominic in New Orleans, Mater Della Rosa in Independence, et cetera, et cetera. The windfall came about as a result of another war, the Spanish Civil War. In 1902, now we're going all the way back, but we'll see how this works. The Archbishop of New Orleans brought Thomas Lorente of the Philippine province to New Orleans and put him in charge of St. Anthony of Padua Parish. Not long after, Lorente established a community of Dominicans there, and in 1911 received permission from the Archbishop to begin a novitiate and a studium called Rosaryville in Ponchatoula for the purpose of avoiding the Spanish military obligations of the time. Other parishes were accepted by the Philippine Dominicans in time. When the Spanish Civil War ended in 1938 in a victory for Franco and the nationalist forces, the persecution of the Spanish church also ended, and with it, the need for this distant refuge. That's when they will return to the Philippines and to Spain, basically, is where these people were coming from. The province of St. Joseph accepted the parishes, and the Dominican Sisters of New Orleans accepted the studium for their novitiate. So that's how we got involved down there. Yes? Way in the back. Yep.
And I'm aware of, my question is, was there any effort for the Dominicans to establish colleges for women? And I'm surmising part of the problem was that you were not in parishes. There are 2 dates that are in controversy regarding Baltimore, Maryland College of Notre Dame and the Sisters of Providence in Indiana. And I was listening when you mentioned both of those states as territories where you were moving through. The 2 dates in controversy are 1847 and 1840 regarding who had the first women's college.
Yeah.
And to my knowledge, that hasn't been resolved except in the minds of either both of them.
Yes.
They were.
Yeah.
But why was there no effort at a women's college
For women.
established by Dominicans?
Every Dominican congregation is going to establish a college or a high school. So you have the sisters so whenever they began coming over, whatever their parent congregation was in Germany or Ireland, or they would come over and almost immediately establish a school for girls. So every congregation, if you go down the Hudson River, you have Newburgh, there's Caldwell College, there's Sparkhill, there is Amityville. They all had their own colleges which were for women. And so Nashville is the same. The Academy at Nashville, the Springs are going to start almost right away. As soon as we establish, these would be more along the lines of grammar schools though, so that would be attached to parishes. So the school in Somerset, for example, is begun almost immediately. And then it will be moved to, it's an academy, it will be moved to Columbus, eventually become St. Mary of the Springs. A lot of those colleges have now, almost all of them have become co-ed, but in the very beginning they were colleges for women. So I think we did, the men kind of took care of the men. Providence College was an all-men's college until the 1970s, the early 70s, and the same was true of the women's colleges.
Well, I think our time has come to a close here. John, thank you very much. This is fascinating. I want you to also note on the back of your program are a list of upcoming events and lectures at Aquinas Institute of Theology. All of those will take place actually at the Institute itself on the corner of Spring and Forest Park Boulevard. You're most welcome, so please mark your calendars and show up at these various
for this opportunity to come together today as a community of learning, to understand a little more of our history, to offer gratitude for the Dominicans in the past who have preceded us, and for those men and women who are pursuing their studies and their lives in the Dominican order. We ask that you continue to bless Father Vidmar, and we look forward to tomorrow celebrating the feast of Thomas Aquinas. We ask all this in Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Well, stay calm, everybody. Tomorrow at 10 o'clock at our double classroom downstairs, room 149, 151, we'll continue this with the Aquinas seminar. You're certainly welcome to attend that if you're free. It will also, I am reliably informed by Tim, our IT guy, will be live streamed. So if you can't make it to the school, just go to www.ai.edu and you'll be able to see what's going on there. So stay calm, everybody. Thank you for coming. See you tomorrow morning, I hope.